Before we begin, if you think you know the story of King Edward II, think again, because history remembers the crown, but it tries to forget what they did to the man who wore it. If you're drawn to the hidden, the horrifying, and the forgotten truths of our past, subscribe to Dark Hours Archive. We don't tell bedtime stories, we wake the dead. Now, let's begin. He was born into power, a prince, a king to be, a symbol of divine right. But from the very beginning, Edward of Carnarvon was not what England expected. He was not a warrior, not a leader, not a man molded by the cold iron of the battlefield. He was different, gentle, romantic, affectionate, more interested in poetry than conquest, in music than politics. And behind the castle walls, that difference wasn't just noticed, it was feared. His father, Edward I, was known as the Hammer of the Scots, ruthless, commanding, a king carved from stone and blood. To him, strength was measured in swords and subjugation. So when he looked at his son, soft, sensitive, drawn to men instead of war, he saw weakness. And weakness, in a royal bloodline, is a kind of disease. Sound, faint echoes of church bells, whispered voices in Latin. When Edward II ascended the throne in 1307, England already trembled. They didn't fear him, they feared what he lacked. The nobles called him unfit, the barons called him a disgrace. And yet, he was king, crowned in gold, draped in ermine, blessed by the church. But beneath the crown, Edward wasn't focused on governance. He was obsessed with a man, Piers Gaveston, a knight, a noble, a man of beauty, charm, and danger. To Edward, he was everything: friend, advisor, companion, and, by every quiet account, his lover. He gifted him lands, titles, lavish clothes, power. He paraded him at court, above his own queen, and the court, the nobles, the kingdom, they hated him for it. Gaveston became a target, a symbol of the king's corruption, of his refusal to rule with strength. In 1312, the nobles had had enough. They kidnapped Piers, mocked him, and then, they beheaded him. Sound of swords slicing the air, then silence. Edward was shattered, and from that moment forward he ruled not with mercy, but with revenge. But his enemies were not few. The nobles continued to rebel. Scotland resisted. France maneuvered. Even his own wife, Queen Isabella, began to turn against him because Edward had replaced Gaveston with Hugh Despenser. And Hugh, unlike Piers, wasn't charming. He was cruel, greedy, manipulative, sadistic. He whispered into Edward's ear, seized lands from barons, exiled rivals, tortured enemies. Together they ruled with fear. The people suffered, the court rotted, and Isabella humiliated, ignored, and cast aside. It not for love, not for justice, but for vengeance. Soundscape, a slow ticking clock, distant thunder rolls. In 1325, she left for France, but she did not go alone. She took her son Prince Edward, heir to the throne, and in France, she found an ally, Roger Mortimer, noble exiled by Edward's regime, a man with a grudge, and an army. Together they plotted, together they prepared to return to England, not as diplomats, but as invaders. Music rises, dark strings layered over heavy, slow drums. In 1326, they landed. Isabella Mortimer, the boy prince. They swept through England with terrifying ease. The people joined them, the nobles cheered them. Edward's army crumbled, even the church turned its gaze. Edward II fled with Hugh Despenser. They ran through forests, hid in monasteries, dressed in disguise. But nowhere was safe. Not anymore. On November 16, 1326, they were captured, dragged before the court. Edward the king was now a prisoner, and Hugh, he was hanged, drawn, quartered, his genitals cut off and burned before his eyes. Then, his heart carved from his chest. It was the message, a warning to kings who loved the wrong man. And Edward, his fate, would be worse, far worse, because death by sword or rope was too clean, too merciful. For a king who had shamed England, betrayed God, and loved like a woman, they needed something else, something unforgettable. Music fades, sound of a fire roaring. A low hum builds underneath, like breath held in. And so, they built the cage. They didn't kill him right away, because that wasn't the point. They wanted him to feel his downfall, to live every hour knowing what was coming, ... and that no one would stop it. After Hugh Despenser's execution, they moved Edward to Berkeley Casella, fortress deep in Gloucestershire, surrounded by shadowed hills, far from the court and far from mercy. They locked him in a cold stone chamber. No light, no attendants, no honor, only the stench of decay, and the sound of rats scratching at the walls. He wasn't just imprisoned, he was unmade, no longer a king, no longer a husband, not even a father, just a problem to be solved. Sound metal chains dragged across stone, a cold wind whips, but Mortimer and Isabella faced a dilemma. You see, they couldn't just murder him in daylight. That would mean blood on their hands. Regicide, killing a king, was a sin against God. It had to look like an accident, or illness, or divine judgment. They needed to erase him without leaving a mark, at least. Not a visible one. For months, Edward languished in the darkness. Some records say he grew sick. Others say he wept daily, asking for his son. But all agree his jailers were instructed to make him suffer, but leave no trace. They starved him, deprived him of sleep. They let his wounds fester. They let him rot, yet he survived. Day after day, week after week. A former king, clinging to life in the dark. This persistence became a problem, and Mortimer grew impatient. He whispered to his assassins. He wanted the death to be final and unforgettable. Music shifts low, sinister strings slowly rising beneath each word. And then came the most infamous method of all, a method whispered by monks, written in foreign letters, recorded with a shudder in every historical text that dares to tell it. They say on the night of September 21st, 1327, Edward was awakened. 2 men entered his chamber. They didn't speak, they didn't need to, he screamed, he fought. But they pinned him down, and then they brought forward an object, a hollow metal tube, polished, narrow, cooled with oil. They forced it between his legs deep into his rectum. He thrashed. He wept, but it was held in place. And then they brought the second object, a red-hot poker, glowing from the forge, burning orange in the shadows, and without a word, they drove it through the tube. Sound, a single, shrill metallic hiss, then a heartbeat, then silence. The heat traveled upward, burning tissue, severing nerves, cooking him from the inside. Why this method? Because it left no external marks, no wounds, no scars. From the outside, Edward would appear untouched, but inside, he was ruined, destroyed, murdered in the most humiliating, agonizing, and symbolic way imaginable. The message was clear. This was not just death, it was punishment. A brutal declaration that a king who ruled through desire, through softness, through deviance, would be purged by fire. Music fades, all is still, only breath remains. The next morning, the guards reported he was dead. Natural causes, they said. A lie whispered through centuries. A lie that history tried to bury. But truth has a way of surviving. Even in the medieval world where violence was routine, where executions were public sport, Edward's death was a horror story. Not just for its cruelty, but for what it meant. It meant that love, when misdirected by power, would be punished. That softness in a king could not be tolerated. That deviation, sexual, political, personal, must be burned out from within. Soundscape, the quiet flicker of candlelight, pages turning, a monk breathing slowly. And so Edward was buried in Gloucester Cathedral. But no great mourners lined the streets. No monuments were built. He was remembered only in whispers, in records hidden in abbeys, in the shaking hands of chroniclers who dared write what they'd heard. But one detail, one final, horrifying image, remains. They say his screams were heard half a mile away, that the castle echoed with them, that birds fled the trees, and that the flames that night silent and secret burned more than flesh. They burned a man's legacy. Edward II was dead, but in the shadows of England's churches, his ghost remained, not in spirit, but in silence, in the fear etched across noble faces, in the absence no one dared to name. The official report claimed illness, a sudden, tragic decline, a king weakened by sorrow and grief, but rumors spread like fire. Rumors about fire, about screams, about a death too brutal to be divine. In the years that followed, whispers crept into every court. Some said Edward survived, that a body double was killed, that he lived out his days as a monk in Italy, that the Vatican knew, and did nothing. Others insisted the story was true, too true, so brutal it had to be real. Because who could invent something so vile? Sound, soft scratching of a quill, candle flame flickering, and in every version, one truth remained. What they did to him was not just murder, it was a message, a warning carved in flame. A myth weaponized by the crown. You see, Edward's death did more than end a life. It set a precedent. It became a template for how to erase a ruler without touching a throne. Because Isabella and Mortimer didn't declare a new monarchy. They crowned Edward soon Edward III, a boy, a puppet, a weapon dressed in royal robes. And behind him stood Mortimer, the true power, the man who'd ordered the poker, the man who now ruled England, from the shadows. But shadows do not last. And secrets are rarely kept for long. sound blades being sharpened, hooves galloping in darkness. By 1330, the boy king was a boy no longer. Edward III, just 17, began to suspect the truth about his father, about Mortimer, about the lies behind the crown on his head. In a dramatic coup, Edward III seized power. Mortimer was arrested, tried, and hanged, his body left to rot, his bones scattered, no honors, no tomb, no mercy. As for Isabella, she was spared, but locked away. She lived out her days in quiet exile, wrapped in velvet, haunted by the sound of screaming kings. But even as justice seemed served, the story would not die, because England remembered, and in that remembering, fear festered. Edward II had not just ruled poorly, he had ruled differently, he had loved differently, he had lived openly, tenderly, rebelliously, in a world that demanded conformity, masculinity, control, and that was his crime. Sound, ticking, breathing, a heartbeat fading in, and so, centuries later, his death became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a tool to scare future kings, to shame future queens, to remind everyone who wore the crown, the throne is not yours, it is England's, and England demands obedience, not affection. Even today, scholars debate the details. Was the poker story a fabrication, a medieval invention, a whispered metaphor for humiliation, or was it real, a hidden truth buried beneath layers of soot and silence? We may never know. But one thing is certain, the pain was real, and so was the fear. Because Edward II's death did not just kill a king, it created a legend, a horror passed down in bone and breath. Soundscape, rain returns, the low moan of wind through a dungeon corridor. Imagine it, the cold of the floor, the weight of the chain, the taste of rust in the air, the red glow approaching in the dark, the knowledge that no one would stop it, not the queen, not the priests, not God. And as the heat rose inside him, he understood, this was not death, this was erasure, a royal lesson written in fire. If you do not fit the crown, it will melt you from the inside. Years passed, but the name Edward II refused to fade, not because people loved him, but because of what had been done to him, because in every whispered tale, every candlelit confession, there lived a single, burning question: was it worth it? Was love worth fire? Was softness worth a death so cruel it scarred a nation's memory? The medieval world didn't allow such questions. It taught obedience, taught power through war, dominance, and fear. A king had to crush. A king had to burn others, not be burned. But Edward chose another path. He chose affection. He chose loyalty not to armies, but to companions, and in the eyes of his enemies that made him dangerous. Not weak, not foolish, but defiant. Sound chains rattle gently. Then a heavy door closes with finality. Isabella and Mortimer never spoke of the method, but the silence was its own confession. What kind of queen signs off on torture? What kind of mother allows her son's father to be reduced to ash from the inside? And what kind of empire watches, and says nothing? England said nothing, and that silence grew teeth. It devoured truth. It reshaped the story into something more convenient, more palatable, more useful. Edouard became a warning, not a tragedy. A lesson in what not to be. Don't be soft, don't be gentle. Don't fall in love the wrong way, or the right way, with the wrong people. Don't lose control, because if you do, you won't just be removed, you'll be destroyed. Music shifts tense, mournful strings playing under the rain. And so Edward became the embodiment of the worst-case scenario, not for rebellion, not for tyranny, but for nonconformity. And while his death was denied, dismissed, doubted, it was never forgotten, not really, because history has a way of turning silence into echoes. In 1594, more than 250 years after Edward's death, Christopher Marlowe wrote a play, Edward II. It shocked the audience, not because of the violence, but because of the love. Marlowe dared to show Edward and Gaveston as more than whispers in a court document. He gave them breath, he gave them pain, he gave them humanity, and by doing so, he forced the world to look again, to remember, to feel. Sound, a page turns, a fire flickers low, casting long shadows. Today, historians still debate, was the death by red-hot poker real, or symbolic? Was it invented to shame, or preserved because it was real? We'll likely never know, but we do know this. No story endures for 700 years without power, and Edward's story still burns, not because of how he ruled, but because of how he died. We know what the chronicles say. We know what the church denied. But what about the man, the boy who became king, the lover who became prey, the monarch who became a warning? He was not heroic. not in the way kings are remembered, but maybe that's the point. Maybe some stories survive not because of triumph, but because of pain. Soundscape fades to a near silence only. A single heartbeat remains. Edward II's legacy is carved not in stone, but in fear, in shadows, in fire. And when you walk through Gloucester Cathedral, when you stand before his tomb, tucked quietly away, you can almost feel it, the weight, the shame, the scream that never left the room. Because even now, centuries later, people still look at that grave and whisper, did they really do that? What they did to Edward II wasn't justice, it wasn't politics, it was a message. A message so violent, so intimate, so grotesque, that it still shivers through the bones of history, because this wasn't about how a king ruled, it was about how he loved, and how an empire built on hierarchy, obedience, and masculine force responded to a man who dared to be something else. Edward wasn't innocent. He made mistakes. He alienated his nobles. He elevated lovers into tyrants. He misread alliances, misjudged enemies, mismanaged war. But his worst sin, in the eyes of his time, he blurred the lines between king and lover, between ruler and companion, between man and weakness. Sound soft bells tolling in slow rhythm, then fading. He didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted to be understood, and in return they gave him flames. But fire does not destroy memory. Sometimes it preserves it, and what remains of Edward is not just a name in a chronicle. It's a feeling, a tension, a mirror we are still afraid to look into, because centuries later, his story still warns us, not about rebellion, not about weakness, but about the price of being different in a world that demands you be the same. Music builds slightly minor key, mournful, echoing like prayer through stone. There are those who say the story of the red-hot poker was fabricated, a smear, a rumor weaponized by his enemies. And maybe it was, but ask yourself this, why did the world believe it so immensely? Why did the chroniclers record it with such detail? Why did it echo for centuries in courts and churches and cathedrals? Because no matter how strange, how awful, how inhuman it sounded, it made sense to them. They believed a man like Edward could meet an end like that. And that belief is its own horror. Long pause. Then, when you strip away the royal title, the court, the crown, the legacy, what's left? A man begging in the dark, burning from the inside out, screaming with no one to hear him, and the silence that followed was more permanent than any grave. Because England didn't just kill a king, it destroyed a voice, and that is why we tell this story. Because here, in the shadows of forgotten thrones, are warnings we must not ignore, histories they tried to bury, names they tried to erase, truths too disturbing for textbooks. Here at Dark Hours Archive, we dig deeper. We find the cracks in the foundation. We listen to the screams between the lines. We remember those who were forgotten, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Dark Hours Archive. We bring you the darkest corners of human history, unfiltered, unflinching, unforgettable. New videos every week. True stories they never wanted told. Comment below. Who should we resurrect next? Because history isn't over. It just sleeps, waiting to be heard again. Soundscape ends on a final deep exhale. The faint flicker of a torch extinguishing, then silence.